entire countries, right? So without the openness, though, I don't think you get to that end result. If you leave it in control of the utility companies, you won't get the same network as if you open it up. I think that is a pretty safe bet to make. So we're certainly thinking in our book about exactly how you go down that path of having not just a smart energy grid, but almost what you might call an open source energy grid. And then, an issue that I'm sure you're discussing and thinking about here too is, what do we do with all of this scientific data and all of the government data? I mean, the government, is probably the largest collector of data that there is. A lot of it is inaccessible to the public or to the average person. And there's a pretty strong argument that actually it would be much more useful if it was in the public domain, because then it could be exploited in the same way that, Apple opens up its iPhone and people create applications that Apple would never have thought of. Well, what if you could take public data or scientific data and create applications, again, that, with that kind of right combination of expertise and experience that maybe the people who originated the data never thought of. Now, I know that there's issues there around kind of the reward system, the incentive structure. If I collected the data, what's my incentive to share it before, I publish my publication in Nature or whatever the case may be. So those kind of things get worked out. But my sense is that there's a growing movement in favor of this global commons for scientific and governmental data. And I think, the balancing thing, it's not that everything should be out in the open. I certainly recognize, and, we've thought a lot about, the importance of patent protection and in providing incentives for commercializing certain inventions. It's about getting that delicate balance between what's in the public domain and what's in the private domain right. And I don't think it's not a cut and dried argument. It's not clear what the right boundary line is, and it seems to be moving all the time. But my sense is that perhaps quite recently in the past decade, we've probably maybe gone too far in the direction of public enterprise and not emphasized the public nature, a lot of these public goods and the role that they can play in producing a much more innovative society. So I want to just wrap up with a couple of thoughts about, and then we'll go to question and answer about how do you get started with this inside your organization? It's a question that comes up a lot. We've sort of been working with blogs or wikis, but how do we really translate this into really genuine innovation in the way we do things? So, we have, as I mentioned, seen a lot of organizations take the kind of tools that have become popular on the public internet, like blogs, like wikis, like social networking, and try to find ways to embed those inside their organization. The problem we find, and this may be a problem you're familiar with, is that you get this situation where you have new technology with the same old process essentially equaling the same old mess, right? Unless you fundamentally change, this is about changing the process, the way that work gets done. It's about taking advantage of new forms of talent. It's about working together differently. It's not just about installing the blog or the wiki and then kind of hoping that things will magically happen. So let me give you a couple of examples that I'm familiar with, because I suspect that we're seeing the adoption of these kind of tools in science all over the place, right? We've got the wiki science and the science blogs and the podcasts and all kinds of innovative projects like Galaxy Zoo. But let's go back just for a second to take a look at what I consider some of the more innovative examples. And perhaps this may be surprising and perhaps not, but actually some of the more innovative examples are actually in government, not necessarily in the private sector. That was a bit of a revelation for us over the past couple of years if we have studied what's been transpiring in government recently. So take the computer patent project at the US Patent Office. Now this is still a prototype, and it hasn't become pervasive across the entire organization. But the basic realization was that they had a deep problem, right? They had a backlog of 1 million patents. And for people who are trying to get their ideas, commercialized and into widespread use, that is a massive problem. And of course, the backlog is worse in the places where the innovation is proceeding most quickly, in places like science, not science, but software and biotechnology. So one way that they might have gone about trying to solve that would be to hire a whole, new array of patent examiners into the size of the bureaucracy. As it turns out, the average examiner today spends less than 12 hours reviewing a single patent application. And for something that grants a 20-year monopoly, you might hope in some cases that actually they might give that a little bit more due diligence and consideration. So, the basic proposition that was put forward by a couple of people, including a colleague of mine, Beth Novick, was that, well, what if you actually opened this up to a whole, array of people who are already, operating in scientific and technical fields and research universities and so forth, who are very well versed in prior art and what the cutting edge of the field may be, and would be able to actually help the patent examiner make a determination of whether the patent they have sitting in front of them is actually a new and useful contribution to the state of the art. So the basic notion was that, they would use social media. They would start to build this network of people who were, leaders in the various fields. They would, take a patent application. It would be posted with the consent of the company involved. It would be posted online. People could review the application. They could spend a few minutes or a few hours looking for prior art. Those instances of prior art could then be uploaded and could be assessed by the entire community. There could be discussions. And then at the end of the day, the community would come back with a recommendation to the patent examiner saying, here's what we found, here's the instances of prior art. They've all been, judged or evaluated by the broader community, and this is what we think you ought to determine. Now, of course, the decision-making still rests with the patent examiner. They haven't taken that power away. What they have done is just tried to make the process more robust. Because as it turns out, the patent examiners, because of the time constraints, usually rely on the internal databases and don't necessarily have access to the latest information from the field. So this, as it turns out, has taken a process that in some cases used to be 3 and 4 years, is now down to 23 months. And they think that if this was more widely adopted and they had a pretty robust community behind it, that actually it could reduce the time to process an application by even more than they've already achieved. So again, an interesting example of how they didn't just install a wiki at the USPTO and hope that something magically would happen in terms of collaboration. They actually thought of a way to rethink the process itself. The other good example, in my view, comes from the intelligence community, again, in the United States. And again, the big, a lot of these things are precipitated by some sort of crisis. For the USPTO, it was that backlog of 1 million patents. For the intelligence community, it was 9/11 and the realization that they were not sharing information effectively across the various agencies responsible for national intelligence and security. If you can believe it, there are 16 separate agencies in the US that have some responsibility for collecting intelligence. And, like the traditional picture of a government bureaucracy, all of the information within those organizations flows vertically up the stovepipe. Very little of it gets horizontally across the community as a whole, even if, as is often the case, there may be people in 5 or 6 of the different agencies working on exactly the same material. They may be working on nuclear non-proliferation, but they haven't even spoken to one another, let alone just shared any information. So the idea was that they would create their own internal version of Wikipedia, except for they would call it Intellipedia, and it wouldn't necessarily be open to the public. Now, this has a couple of ways of looking at the advantages of this. This is something that my contact at the CIA shared with me. They use this to help sell the system internally. And you can see here on the one hand that there's a big advantage between email-based collaboration and wiki collaboration. There's a big advantage of wiki collaboration that it cuts out a lot of this redundancy and the version control problems. But really, to me, that's just that's not really the significant part. The significant part is that you've got this intelligence agency vetting process, right? All of it ultimately flows up to the Director of National Intelligence, who reports directly to the President. Now, if you've got the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the DIA, all reporting, through their own intelligence vetting process, then you're missing all the synergies in between them. So the idea is that Intellipedia provides this place to kind of think out loud, for people to gather information, for people to take off their agency hats and kind of think about their various, field of endeavor and field of inquiry, and operate as a sort of set of horizontal communities that works cohesively. But the big challenge ultimately is to change the intelligence agency vetting process itself, right? To move towards what they're calling living intelligence. This notion that you don't just, produce this document that gets kind of stamped by the director and communicated to the presidents. You have this kind of real-time evolving knowledge base that is, spanning across all of these various agencies. So for me, this is, you know, even if you think about that in terms of, you know, this is what's happening in the scientific world, right? Take down all of the silos.